Other people, Caitlin's therapist, had tried to call APD to give them information about a possible motive. They discounted her. They discounted all information that was anything other than what information they wanted to go on, that this was a random drive-by shooting. 4 Hispanic young men were falsely charged with the shooting of Caitlin Arquette. Yet, logical suspects, a man found standing next to the scene with later developed to be ties to the Vietnamese, ties to police officers, ties to the police officer that happened to have processed the Hispanic suspects just a couple of months before. It seems that there is a relationship between people that are not being examined. We took the case to APD several times. After I verified that the Paul Apodaca was in fact the man at the scene when he confirmed it. Prior to that, I had operating under the assumption that APD knew all this information. It just wasn't in the information available to me. I was sure that they were following up on everything and that everything that I was seeing as an investigative hypothesis was just that, a working hypothesis that I was teaching my students about. APD had done none of the follow-up that should have been done. So I wrote, in good faith, an analysis report, 75 pages if I remember right, and I hand-carried it to the Albuquerque Police Department and delivered it to Chief Polisar, who was the chief at that time, to his secretary. Sometime later, there was an article in the paper that the Arquette family had offered nothing of information to the Albuquerque Police Department. I countered that by saying that we had provided information. The chief said the information must have been lost in the mail. It couldn't have been lost in the mail. I hand-carried the report. Throughout my investigation, I have given every piece of information I have developed to law enforcement. It should be law enforcement who solves this case. If law enforcement made a mistake deliberately or unconsciously, it should be them who resolves it. I want them to resolve it. My background is law enforcement. I respect law enforcement. I was a good law enforcement officer, and I do not want the Albuquerque Police Department to let the fact stand that there may be some corruption in this case. After submitting the initial analysis report, I did meet with Detective Gallegos in person, and I shared with him the information about Paul Apodaca. Interesting statement to me by people at APD, Detective Gallegos in particular, that they would be willing to talk to me about anything but not about the Vietnamese. If it had to do with the Vietnamese, they would not listen. And my point was, I had lots of information that didn't even necessarily involve the Vietnamese. So I consistently tried to share my information to and with APD. At what point, I'm not sure how we got the arrangement or the interview, Mr. and Mrs. Arquette and I were hosted at a meeting in his office by new then Chief Galvin. I was surprised to find out that that was the first time that any police chief had talked to the Arquette family. Chief Galvin seemed truly interested in the case, truly interested in what I was saying, as if he had never heard anything of what I was saying, and in fact asked me, "Who are you, and where is this information you have?" He turned to Deputy Chief Chris Padilla, who was in the room, and like, "Do we know this?" And Chief Galvin said we were going to look into it and that we were going to have the cold case unit take a look at the Caitlin Arquette case. Mr. and Mrs. Arquette and myself left the meeting so positive. That weekend, there was an article in the newspaper quoting the supervisor of the cold case unit saying we would not be opening a cold case. A couple of years later, another opportunity came for me to talk with Captain Hannigan. She was the captain of the Violent Crimes Unit. I met with them. I met with her. Again, Deputy Chief Padilla came into the room. Captain Hannigan indicated, do we know this information, to Deputy Chief Padilla? And Deputy Chief Padilla said, we know everything about this case we care to know. Ultimately, I met with Detective Roberts at the APD Cold Case Unit. Again, totally interested in this case, totally interested in the fact that Paul Apodaca was a logical suspect to have been interviewed, at least a witness that should have been interviewed. They agreed that they would interview him. He was at that time in prison in southern New Mexico. Everything was being put into place. Detective Roberts had contacted Detective Merriman. Detective Merriman said that he would come in to talk as long as everybody involved was sitting around the table together. And the opportunity to interview Paul Apodaca was imminent when a witness resurfaced. That's the classification that I was told. A witness that had been an eyewitness to the shooting of Caitlin Arquette by the Hispanic suspects had come back to New Mexico, reinforced the statement, but was afraid then, was afraid now, and would not come forth. Therefore, that reinforced the Albuquerque police position that the case was a random drive-by shooting, that the Hispanics were the suspects, and therefore there was no need to interview Paul Apodaca. I believe that was in 2005. To this day, Paul Apodaca has never been interviewed except by me about his involvement, an admitted involvement, at least being a major witness to this day. This case is so complicated. Our database of names has almost 500 names. We have multiple locations. We have several cases, other killings, in which the people in the Arquette case link back to these people. This is not a random, isolated case. This is a case that is part of something bigger that people do not seem to want to recognize. And this is what makes it very difficult to relate such a complicated case. When you work a case, you can work it in what's called real time. You get the information as it happens, often out of sequence. So you learn a piece of information here, you learn a piece of information here, you learn something over here that later amplifies or minimizes the information you know. Working in cold case means that you have access to everything years later. You can take it, put it in logical sequential order, and everything makes different sense. NIA, my company, worked this case both ways. We worked it real time. We did exactly what everybody did in the real time as it said in the information was available to us. And then we worked at cold case. And we continue to find inconsistencies, lies, information that APD will not explain, and reports in which key words and terms are modified. For example, the Albuquerque Police Department had put out a news flash that they were looking for information on the VW bug that the neighbor saw, made that unusual U-turn. The headline in the newspaper said, "Police looking for gray VW. If you have any information about a gray VW bug, let us know." People from Caitlin's apartment call up with information to say they saw a gray or black VW bug being spray painted in Caitlin's apartment complex by the Vietnamese friends of the boyfriend. When the police report is written, it said the neighbors said they were spray painting a small car. No one would describe a Volkswagen Bug as a small car. Similarly, when the neighbor sees the Volkswagen Bug making the U-turn in the dirt lot, as what's described in the police report, they left out the information that it had a physical address. It was a location. There were possible witnesses in that location. Continual examples of information that's inconsistent, misrepresented, omitted, and managed causes me to come to the conclusion that this case is not to be solved, that the Albuquerque Police Department does not want this case to be solved. I just wanted to read 2 sentences that are my conclusions about this case. APD persons omitted, compartmentalized, and manipulated aspects of the Caitlin Arquette investigation, which has caused the case to remain unsolved, and instances of manipulation of case information occurred early on in the case and continue even after the case is closed. We recommend and request an outside comprehensive review of APD's initial incident reports and the handling of this case from the beginning for instances of nonfeasance, misfeasance, malfeasance, and possible obstruction of justice for this victim and for the citizens of Albuquerque. That this case is so connected to other criminal activities in New Mexico, in California, deaths, drugs, unusual relationships with police informants, and the involvement of police information, police officers, makes this case ripe for a cover-up.